For 1,500 years, mud buried a message that church history never recorded. A mosaic command to Peter, delivered in Jesus' name, unknown to the Bible and hidden beneath a lost city's floor. Archaeologists have just decoded these forbidden words, and they challenge everything we thought was settled about authority, memory, and the very ground where faith began. What else did we miss beneath centuries of silence? Sweat clung to shirts as diesel engines rattled through the thick, humid air. The Sea of Galilee's northern shore, once a bustling harbor, had turned into a battlefield of mud and machines. Each summer, the sun hammered down, pushing temperatures past 40 degrees Celsius. The air smelled of decay, stirred by the constant churn of pumps. Water seeped into every trench, threatening to erase weeks of work and hours. Archaeologists and engineers moved in a rhythm shaped by the lake's moods. The team's geophysicist hunched over a laptop, eyes fixed on jagged lines crawling across the screen. Ground-penetrating radar swept back and forth in slow, careful arcs, mapping what lay beneath the silt. The survey grid stretched across the exposed mudflats, marked by bright flags and battered tape measures. Each square meter demanded its own battle, sometimes yielding nothing but soggy pottery shards, sometimes a promising echo deep below the surface. The grid covered hundreds of square meters, each patch a potential window into the past. The lake's water level had dropped to 214.68 meters below sea level, the lowest in decades. That drop, nearly 60 centimeters in a single year, exposed ground untouched since the Byzantine era. But the same receding waters brought new problems. Mud, saturated and heavy, threatened to swallow boots and tools alike. Every morning, the field director checked the pumps. Submersible engines ran day and night, pulling up 20,000 liters of water an hour just to keep the trenches dry. Diesel fumes mingled with the earthy smell, and maintenance became a daily ritual. Filters clogged with silt, hoses split under pressure, and every breakdown risked flooding the site before anything could be recorded. Pumps were life or death for the dig. Surveyors worked in shifts, mapping the area with GPS and radar, logging finds with mud-smeared hands. The team's workflow ran like clockwork: mark a square, scan the subsurface, flag possible anomalies. Only then did the digging begin, trowels scraping through centuries of layered silt. The conditions tested everyone. By midday, shirts clung with sweat, and the only relief came from the steady whir of the pumps. The lake seemed determined to reclaim its secrets, flooding trenches as quickly as they were opened. But the team pressed on, trusting the radar's silent signals and the data streaming in from the survey lines. Relentless work edged them forward. The grind was relentless, the payoff uncertain. Yet in this struggle between technology and the land, every hour spent in the mud brought them closer to the moment when stone, not soil, would answer back. Stone might speak if they kept listening. A sudden metallic clang shattered the monotony of scraping and shoveling. The sound cut through the drone of pumps and the low chatter of exhausted workers. It was a volunteer kneeling at the edge of a trench whose trowel had struck something solid, something that did not give like the layers of mud and pottery fragments they had been fighting for weeks. Word traveled fast along the grid. Within minutes, the area filled with archaeologists and field assistants, all eyes fixed on the patch of earth where the tool had hit stone. The volunteers' hands, shaking with adrenaline, cleared away the last clumps of silt. What surfaced was not a random rock, but a block of masonry, its edge sharp, the angle precise. More careful scraping revealed another joining at a perfect right angle. This was not the foundation of a fisherman's hut or the remains of a collapsed wall. The stones were massive, squared, and tightly fitted, built for permanence. As the trench widened, the outlines of a structure began to take shape. The walls ran straight and true, forming a rectangle that dwarfed the modest dwellings found elsewhere in the village layers. Then, as the team traced the course of the stones, they found the arc of a curve, subtle at first and then unmistakable. The arc swept out from the end of the main wall, forming a half-moon niche. Anyone familiar with early Christian architecture would recognize the shape: an APSE, the focal point of a church where the altar would have stood. The discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the team. The presence of an apse meant this was no ordinary building. It was the heart of a basilica, a structure built for worship, not for daily life. The position of the walls matched the descriptions found in centuries-old travel diaries, accounts from pilgrims who claimed to have visited the house of Peter. For generations, local fishermen had passed down stories of carved stones that surfaced during droughts, hints of something grand buried beneath the mud. Now those legends seemed less like folklore and more like a record of memory that had survived where written history had failed. The geometry of the find left little doubt. The masonry was aligned with the shoreline, just as ancient visitors had described. The apse faced east, in keeping with Byzantine tradition, and the dimensions suggested a building constructed to impress, not just to shelter a congregation. Archaeologists documented every measurement, every angle, every seam in the ancient mortar. The evidence built a case too strong to ignore. This was a monumental church, its altar set above the ruins of an earlier age. The mud that had hidden it for 15 centuries had also kept it safe from looters, from weather, from the slow erosion of time. The anonymous volunteer who struck stone that day had cracked open a sealed chapter of history. What lay beneath the surface was no longer a rumor or a hope. It was carved in limestone, calculated to endure. The dig had crossed a threshold. In the space of a single heartbeat, the story of the site had shifted from guesswork to certainty. The search for a vanished city had found its anchor in stone. Sunlight caught the first glimmers of color as mud was rinsed from the ancient floor. Reds as deep as pomegranate seeds, blues bright as the Galilee sky, and yellows that seemed to hold the memory of centuries emerged from the grime. The mosaic surface, hidden for over 1,500 years, revealed a world of tiny tesserae, each one cut by hand, each one pressed into mortar by someone who could never have imagined this moment. At the center of the floor, a black double line traced a perfect circle, measuring just over 1 meter across. Within that ring, a medallion stood out, its geometry unbroken, despite the weight of centuries. The colors inside the medallion were richer, protected by the mud and the darkness. Patterns twisted and repeated, floral vines, interlocking diamonds, and a Greek inscription that ran clean and bold along the arc. The letters, set in stone, spelled out a message that had waited centuries for another pair of eyes to read them. The dig's epigraphist, called in from Jerusalem, crouched beside the medallion. Her tools were simple: a soft brush, a flask of distilled water, a battered notebook. She worked in silence, tracing each letter with the tip of her finger, calling out the shapes to a colleague who copied them down. The script was unmistakable: Byzantine uncials with lunate sigmas and squared omicrons, matching the style found in churches across Galilee from the 5th and 6th centuries. The formula was familiar to her: a donor's name, a humble declaration of service, and a dedication to someone far greater. She read aloud: Constantinos, servant of the Messiah, to the chief and commander of the heavenly apostles. The words curved with the medallion's edge, each one laid with care by a craftsman whose hands had shaped prayers into stone. The phrase for Peter, chief and commander, was not casual. It echoed the language of Byzantine liturgy, titles reserved for the apostles said to hold the keys of heaven. The inscription served as both a petition and a proclamation, linking the floor beneath their feet to the stories that had drawn pilgrims here for centuries. The colors deepened as the last traces of silt were washed away. The reds and blues formed a halo around the black lettered ring, the yellow tesserae catching the late afternoon light. The mosaic was a map of devotion, its palette chosen as much for beauty as for meaning. Every hue had survived fire, flood, and the slow pressure of mud. The medallion's size, just over 1.2 meters, made it impossible to miss, a deliberate centerpiece in a church built to impress. But even as the inscription came into focus, something else tugged at the edges of the medallion. Inside the bold letters, fainter strokes lingered, almost invisible, worn down by centuries of footsteps. The epigraphist paused, her attention caught by the ghost of another line, a whisper of script that seemed to circle the heart of the medallion. The tools of archaeology had uncovered the beauty of the mosaic. Now the tools of science would be needed to chase these fading shadows into the light. Infrared scanners flickered to life in the late afternoon, their beams sweeping across the medallion's inner ring. The epigraphist steadied her hand, watching as the faintest traces of Greek letters began to glow on the monitor. Each pass of the scanner revealed more: a slender tau, the curve of an omicron, the angular lines of a kappa, signs nearly erased by centuries of footsteps and the slow grind of silt. The mosaic's outer inscription declared, "Konstantinos, servant of the Messiah, dedicates to the chief and commander of the heavenly apostles." But the inner circle whispered something different, a line fragmented and barely visible, its meaning hanging in the air. A hush settled as she read aloud, voice steady but tinged with disbelief. He said to him, "Guard my house, for I go." The phrase was not part of any known gospel. The Greek matched the cadence of ancient speech, but its source eluded even the experts. Theologians called in by phone and video from Jerusalem, Rome, and Athens listened to the preliminary translation. One Orthodox scholar pointed out the familiar formula of Byzantine dedications: saints petitioned for protection, churches entrusted to apostolic guardians. Yet the wording here broke the mold. It sounded less like a prayer and more like a direct command, as if spoken from master to disciple. A Catholic theologian compared the phrase to the canonical "feed my sheep" from the Gospel of John, but noted the difference in tone and imagery. Guard my house suggested something more concrete, a physical space to be protected, not just a flock to be tended. A Protestant historian poring over high-resolution scans raised a cautious note. The text's faintness left room for debate. The paleography matched 5th or 6th century mosaics from across Galilee, with lunate sigmas and squared omicrons. But the inner letters were lighter, almost intentionally subtle. Was it a deliberate act of humility, or simply the wear of 1,000 years? The church historian traced the phrase's echoes through centuries of Christian tradition. Dedications to Peter as chief and commander were common, but a direct order to guard a house, especially from a figure claimed as Christ, was rare, if not unprecedented. The only parallels came from scattered fragments of agrapha, sayings attributed to Jesus but never canonized. Some appeared in dusty papyrus scraps from Oxyrhynchus or in the pages of the Gospel of Thomas, but none matched this exact wording. The team gathered around the medallion, each expert weighing the evidence. The outer text was proven, its meaning clear. The inner ring, revealed by technology but still shrouded in uncertainty, offered a narrative twist that transformed the mosaic from a beautiful relic into a theological puzzle. Graphics mapped the distinction: bold lines for what was certain, dotted borders for what remained interpretive. The debate was only beginning, but the implications were impossible to ignore. The medallion's voice, silent for centuries, had spoken again, leaving scholars to argue over what and whose words had truly been found. Directly beneath the mosaic, trowels scraped away layers of silt to reveal a puzzle of stone and artifact. The first surprises were not religious relics, but the everyday tools of a fishing village: lead net weights, corroded hooks, and clay lamps, all pressed into mud that had sealed them since the 1st century. The field director called for careful documentation. Each find was logged, bagged, and labeled, then compared against the layers above and below. Coins surfaced next, bronze pieces stamped with the profile of Emperor Nero, their patina unmistakable. Numismatic analysis placed their minting between 54 and 68 CE, the exact window when Bethsaida was still known as a working harbor. Deeper still, the team uncovered a wall running at a sharp angle beneath the Byzantine apse. Its stones were rougher, smaller, and set in a style typical of domestic Roman construction. Stratigraphy confirmed it predated the church by centuries. Nearby, a second wall, built in the 2nd or 3rd century, had been boxed in by the later basilica's foundation. The Byzantine builders had encased this wall with precision, creating a rectangular enclosure that stood out from the chaotic remains of other village dwellings. The boxed-in wall's placement was no accident. Plans from the dig showed the church's apse centered directly over this preserved structure, as if the architects meant to protect whatever lay within. The dirt floor inside remained untouched, left bare rather than paved. This level of care suggested the Byzantine builders believed they were marking a site of special significance, perhaps the very house that ancient pilgrims had described in their journals. For the field director, the material sequence, fishing gear, Roman coins, and boxed-in domestic walls offered the most concrete link yet between the biblical village and the mosaic above. Conservation teams returned to the site as soon as the last trowel left the trench. The mosaic, now fully exposed, was at its most vulnerable. Every color, every letter risked fading in the open air. Heavy sandbags were hauled in and stacked across the floor, sealing the medallion beneath a protective layer. That reburial, completed in early October 2023, was not defeat. It was protocol. Until the science could catch up, preservation came first. Behind the scenes, the work entered a new phase. Conservators logged every detail, from humidity readings to mortar composition. Plans for AMS radiocarbon dating were drawn up, targeting organic traces trapped in the mortar and the fill beneath the mosaic. The team's digital archive grew with every scan: high-resolution images, infrared stacks, and 3D models, each file destined for peer review. The goal was clear: transparency. Every dataset would be released alongside the journal submission, allowing outside experts to scrutinize the evidence. Interpretation, though, demanded caution. The main inscription, Peter's title, the donor's dedication, stood on solid ground. The faint inner ring, possible agrapha, remained a hypothesis. No raw scans had been published, and rival scholars pressed for independent verification before any claim could enter the academic record. One conservator summed it up: until the imaging and epigraphy are reviewed by neutral eyes, every speculative reading must carry a warning label. The process is slow, but in archaeology, patience is the price of credibility. The next steps belong to the data, not to legend or wishful thinking. For now, the mosaic rests in silence, waiting for the science to speak. Ancient words, long hidden, now surface as tradition, archaeology, and technology collide. As scholars debate their meaning, one fact stands: the ground still reveals what history tried to erase. In an age when foundations everywhere feel unstable, the call to guard the house asks us what we're willing to protect, and what we might rediscover when the past refuses to stay buried. What would you guard? Let me know below.